Hello everyone, distinguished colleagues. Today, Daniela Gutiérrez and me, Camila Gutiérrez, we want to present a study on the fundamental geopolitical transformation of the Arctic. Yes, this day is becoming more and more common to talk about the Arctic, but for decades, the region was defined by Arctic exceptionalism, a post-Cold War norm where basically there was environmental cooperation but superseded the military competition. However, as we can see these days, and as the ice recedes, the Arctic has transitioned into a primary theater of systemic competition. Let's say that these days is more systematic than systemic. The first widely recognized case of a commercial non-icebreaker cargo ship completing an Arctic transit without direct icebreaker escort happened was in 2009. And that's when our eyes came up and we were popping up because two German heavy lift vessels, the Beluga Fraternity and Beluga Foresight, operated by Beluga Shipping, sailed through the North Sea Road. And that was like the first time that we had heard about this. The road was from South Korea to the Netherlands via the Arctic. But they did receive assistance indeed. It was limited to those difficult sections, but for significant stretches, they navigate independently, something that it was not previously done. So at this commercial scale, it was very impressive. No? What was the impact? In reality, well, let's say that the route cut about 4,000 nautical miles compared to the traditional route of the Suez Canal. But it's happening more and more frequently. In 2017, a tanker completed the Northern Sea Road without icebreaker assistance. In 2018, a container ship, Benta Mares, we all know or had seen the container Mares, had done it as well. In 2024, the Russian tanker Storman Skuratov was explicitly reported sailing without icebreaker assistance and, of course, under the rule of Russia. Thanks to its high ice class design, it was very impressive. And also, in the last year, in 2025, we had seen some different achievements because it's not the most indifferent thing, and these days we can see that it's more continuous. So basically what we had seen in 2025, it was more than impressive. It was there were a ship, and not one, ships, different ships sailing the Northern Sea Road without booking icebreaker escorts, and those include some oil tankers in the so-called shadow fleet. So if we think about those milestones in a global context where the channels are under control or under war or by a conflict, this perspective changes our minds. So let's start with our presentation. That's the reason why we had to start. So basically, this research argues that the shift is best understood through structural realism. And yes, we're internationalists, so we're gonna use the realism. We're witnessing a transition from a previous inaccessible frontier into a contested arena where multi-nice caps redefine sovereignty and open new avenues for power projection and resource accumulation. So basically what we have used is the core theoretical framework is a mix of realism and geopolitics theory. Three concepts help us on the analysis. First, anarchy, because according to Kenneth Walls, the behavior of a state is dictated by an anarchic international system that compels units to prioritize self-help and survival. Second is multipolarity, because we have moved beyond the unipolar era into what Richard Haas called as a war of multiple poles. The Arctic is now a critical space where this multipolarity is actively contested. So finally, we want to shift the realist perspective through the offensive realism, following Mearsheimer, we see great powers like the United States, Russia, and increasingly China acting as the rational actors seeking to maximize their share of war power to achieve regional hegemony. So what we have seen is basically the structural realists help us to understand the environmental and structural change and shift on this perspective. So let's talk about the geopolitics of resources. Basically, what we're saying here is that the centrality of the Arctic is inextricably linked to its physical wealth. There are some authors like Michael Clark who argues that in resource wars, the scarcity of traditional commodities is a primary driver of global conflict. And the power under ice, as we had called this this speech, the Arctic seabed is estimated to hold 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its natural gas. There are some authors like Jerwin that defines that this is as the cornerstone of energy security for the 21st century. For a state like Russia, where the Arctic already counts for 20% of the GDP, projects like Jamal LNG are not merely commercial, they're existential. And we have to go beyond energy, like talking about critical minerals, because the region contains rare earth elements vital for both the green energy transition and advanced military technology. So there are clues on this new shift. But also we have discussed the maritime routes. The Northern Sea Road, the NSR, and Northern West Passage offers ways to bypass traditional choke points like the Malacca Strait, or there are some authors like Jeff Collins that note these roads are becoming central to the geopolitical calculus of petrostates. So now that we have the Iran case, or we're having the OPEC project, we have to think about how can we achieve the sustainability and how we can transform or understand this transformation. Let's move into the third part. So basically, we're going to start analyzing these dynamics. Our study utilized a most likely case study design, focusing on the Eurasian Arctic between 2014 and 2025, last year. And we used independent variable. It was the multipolar competition for strategic resources, and the dependent variable was the level of strategic conflict manifested through indirect militarization. But those are not the only variables. We have some intervening variables. The logic of low intensity proxy war, utilizing non-state actors and dual use infrastructure, were counting in our study. We adopt a qualitative approach and triangulating official policy documents like the Russia's Arctic Strategy to 2035, institutional communication from the Arctic Council, and specialized research from centers such as SIPRI. And also, just to be more clear, we use a special delimitation. We focus on the Russian exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, and the Barents Sea, because they both represent the highest density of resources and the most advanced degree of effective militarization. So, analysis of the basic principle of Russian Federation state policy in the Arctic to 2035 that was shown on 2020 demonstrate that the Kremlin views the Arctic not merely as a commercial asset, but as a strategic resource base essential for national survival. And this securitization of resources where hydrocarbons are linked directly to sovereignty is a hallmark of realist behavior. The Russian government's massive investment in the Vostok oil and Jamal LNG projects serve as a material indicator of this priority. As noted by Daniel Jardine in 2011, energy security in the 21st century is synonymous with state power. For Russia, controlling the Arctic estimated 13% of global undiscovered oil is the key to maintaining its great power status in a multipolar system. In our findings, the logic of indirect militarization, our research reveals that while open conflict remains unlikely due to the extreme environment, the region is experiencing a securitization of resources. We identify three primary mechanisms of this competition. First, the dual use infrastructure, because the states are developing civilian search and rescue bases and satellite stations across the Siberian coast. These facilities provide a logistical backbone for rapid military mobilization while maintaining a facade of commercial cooperation. Uh, Russia, Russia's Shamrock base on Alexandria land is a prime example of this dual use strategy, for instance. But we also have seen some actors like China and the NATO that they are using different tactics, different strategies. But those are like proxy, they're attending like a proxy vanguard, right? Establishing physical claims and also using it for extraction. We can see that there is a lot of interplay of the poles and a dense web of strategic signaling. So it is interesting how is the way that we're shifting and those main actors, because there are 8 states that has visibility and interest. We can't forget the presence of the European Union through Denmark, but also how is dispute this territory and how we are using it in the different type of states. So let's go further in the following part of our content. Because definitely, yes, the state has something to say, but state-owned enterprises as proxies are important. Companies like Rosneft, Gazprom, and CNPC act as the vanguard of national interests. By securing drilling rights, these entities establish a permanent national presence in disputed waters that will be diplomatically sensitive if done directly by the military. So we're talking about the gray zone tactics. We observe a rise in hybrid incidents, including GPS jamming in northern Norway and the cutting of undersea cables. This is a reflection, or this reflects a logic of low intensity proxy dynamics rather than direct kinetic battle. But this is also the security dilemma. As Stephen Wall posits, states form alliances against perceived threats. The revitalization of NATO's northern flank and Russia's militarization of its coastline reflect a classic security dilemma, because these defensive measures by one are interpreted as offensive threats by others. And this is how this is all mixing. Because definitely the Arctic is no longer a regional issue, it is a global one. Let's talk about the Chinese factor. China has defined itself as near Arctic state, lacking territorial claims. Beijing utilized its Polar Silk Road initiative to gain access through investment in Russian infrastructure, such as Greenlandic mining or the Siberian ports. This represents a classic realist alignment of convenience to balance the United States influence. So when we see the 2022 inflection point, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 served as a critical data point, freezing the Arctic Council and accelerating Russian-Chinese energy cooperation. This has reinforced the Mearsheimer trap. Even if states prefer peace, the structural requirement through or requirement to secure resources in an uncertainty world forces them into a cycle of competitive militarization. Basically, we can summarize and say that this gray zone is completely changing. So we can say that in conclusion, the Eurasian Arctic has become a theater of structural realist competition. The power under ice is not just the hydrocarbons themselves, but achieving the global distribution of power that their accessibility facilitates, while the conflict remains indirect, mediated through state enterprise proxies and dual-use infrastructure. The underlying logic is one of zero-sum competition for power. As the ice continues to recede, the Arctic will move from the periphery to the very center of international security. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. See you later. Bye.